Hi, my name is Jayreid. I'm a psychotherapist in San Francisco, California. And today I'd like to talk about the importance of interruption in recovering from the trauma of narcissistic abuse. So trauma is very simply defined as a stressor that outstrips an organism's abilities to cope at the time. And in the case of narcissistic abuse, I think trauma readily applies. So if we think of the context, particularly between a parent and child, the child is oriented to need the parent for survival in an attachment sense. The parent harbors a deep sense of worthlessness that they're always striving to keep at bay and sort of try to locate it conveniently for the parent in the child, the scapegoated child especially. So for the child, they have the need for a parent to be there for them. And instead, they're met with hostility and contempt due to the parent's own psychological problems. That situation, I think, we could inherently define as traumatic because the child's needs are going unmet for a secure attachment figure. On top of that, they're having to cope in the process of trying to find someone to attach to with hostility, sort of with danger coming from that same parent. So I think pretty readily aligns with this definition that this situation and the stress induced by the child would sort of exceed the child's abilities to cope at the time. So much of, I think, the purpose of these videos is to really shed some light on what things were like back then, but most importantly, too, to talk about how can one's quality of life be prioritized and improved after surviving such treatment. I think coming out of a narcissistically abusive relationship, that oftentimes there's sort of a post-traumatic psychological landscape in place due to what was needed to be done in order to cope with the sort of uncopable during the abuse. And that post-traumatic psychological landscape really is encapsulated by the beliefs that I've mentioned in other videos that are often held by survivors of narcissistic abuse. Beliefs such as, I don't deserve protection, I'm always one mistake away from complete ruin, a belief such as I am physically disgusting, and so forth. Those beliefs, I think, needed to be adopted to survive this traumatic arrangement. But following the abuse, they actually can function to persist the effects of the trauma. I had a very dear friend and colleague, actually, a psychologist, who he had been diagnosed with a brain tumor and was incredibly, I think, brave and insightful as we would talk about, and he wrote about what life would feel like after the diagnosis and sort of living with the dreadful uncertainty of how long the remission would last or if there'd be a recurrence. And he thought of trauma as sort of a set, just like a set for a movie or a play, where there's sort of predefined roles, there's a script, and there's sort of a repetition that just keeps and keeps happening. In the post-traumatic landscape, the potential for sort of new outcomes gets eliminated. That's partially by design, because when we've been traumatized badly enough and really feel like that something like that might happen again, then a sort of the uncertainty that's required in order for a new outcome to happen is not our friend. And my friend that I'm discussing here would talk about how he would rewatch episodes of his favorite show, which happened to be Yellowstone, which is a really good show. And he would watch it, and he'd say, like, look, I wouldn't get bored. I wasn't watching it for the entertainment value. What he explained was he was watching it in order to, because he knew what would happen, and that offered him a sort of a degree of comfort, actually, a reassurance that when filled with the dreadful uncertainty of like what's going to happen with his health, knowing how this episode was going to end and what would happen in it and seeing it play out was helpful. It helped to kind of reduce some of the anxiety and some of the effects of the trauma he was going through. I think in the process, and I'm sure my friend would endorse this, in the process of recovering from a trauma, that there is always a risk of kind of reifying or reinforcing that loop of knowing what's already happened and replaying it. And I think in the case of recovering from narcissistic abuse, there's a similar risk in terms of like looking and focusing so much on the narcissistic abuser and what they did to the survivor. And in the course of doing so, there can be this sort of iterative loop. In some ways, it's very important to speak about what one was put through and be witnessed by someone who you trust and who is safe. And at the same time, there's a sort of a parallel importance of continuing to focus on oneself in the here and now and taking seriously what is important to you now and in your future and how you envision your own life. That's important because doing so requires us embracing of a certain level of uncertainty. I mean, none of us know, if we're sort of here in this present moment, exactly what's going to happen tomorrow, a week from now, a month from now. And that's good because it means we're sort of like, in a way, honestly here when that uncertainty is accepted. And coming out of narcissistic abuse, that uncertainty, I think, can be incrementally reintroduced to one's experience of themselves and their lives. Too much too soon could run the risk of being re-traumatizing. And so having supportive relationships, again, cultivating over and over a relationship with yourself, again, and I'll talk about how to do that in a little bit, becomes very important. In the discipline of mindfulness or Buddhism, they talk a lot about impermanence, that no matter what we are experiencing right now, the only guarantee is that it's going to change. That there's a natural sort of ebb and flow of everything that happens in our inner experience. When we've been traumatized, there's, I think, a very natural reaction to try to limit what was bad, because bad has been known to be horrifically bad, maybe even at the time feeling like it was unsurvivably bad. And relatedly, what is felt to be good, there can be a real motivation to try to make what is good permanent. So sort of avoid the bad because of how horrific it has felt and make the good sort of last all the time. That's only because, the bad feels unsurvivable, and the only rescue that can be felt, again, in a post-traumatic psychological landscape, is to keep the good going all the time. But what happens is, as one system gets dialed into that type of coping approach, it sort of gums up the works, our inner works. And that's when certain things like dissociation can come in, avoidance and numbing and so forth. And I think the goal in recovery from this, from a trauma lens, is to safely and incrementally re-expose oneself to that ebb and flow. There's I think a great quote that is a Persian adage, actually, that I'm sure everyone's familiar with, and it's just that this too shall pass. It's as if it's written into our DNA that everything has an impermanence and a course to it. And so long as we are sort of allowing of that impermanence to occur, then we're sort of aligned. And it's, I think, the effort to dictate what passes and what doesn't that can kind of make trauma last longer. Again, and I say that with an eye towards the need for gentleness in this, and if one feels stuck, that it's okay to also feel stuck. That's part of, I think, the recovery process too. So I really want to offer that kind of understanding of recovery from narcissistic abuse and thinking of it as the process of recovering from a trauma, of something that outstripped your abilities to cope at a certain moment in time. And so it's certainly understandable to want to avoid change, particularly in one's inner states. I think it can be important to, or hopefully useful, to think about how it's the invitation of a change in what happens internally that ultimately can be really, really important for sort of a recovery from that kind of post-traumatic psychological landscape. And I want to just, again, offer another rationale why the breath can be so important in this process. To regularly focus upon and interrupt whatever it is you're doing to bring your attention to your inhale, it can often be through the nose, and exhale through the nose for a few minutes, multiple times a day, that just draws our attention to something that is constantly changing, our breaths. And you know, when I think about all the beliefs that can be held by the scapegoated child that I've mentioned and focused on in other videos, all those beliefs are defied by just the simple act of turning one's attention to your breath. So, for instance, the belief of I'm always one mistake away from complete ruin. To, say, be at work and be having to labor under that type of a belief, to turn your attention to your breath, focus on that for a few minutes, in essence is saying it's more important for me to turn towards my breath and notice that than to avoid what I believe is about to happen. And that can be very sort of therapeutic in this way. Similarly, the belief of I'm physically disgusting. To turn towards your breath is sort of an inherent valuing of your physical being and noticing of your breath. There's counteractive there. The belief of I am defective, as horrible as that belief can feel, turning towards your breath, I think implicitly defies that. Because again, it's saying, hey, there's nothing wrong with my breath. I'm paying attention to it and I'm noticing it in and out. And, you know, I could go on, but I just think I know it's very sort of simple, but it's I just think so powerful, this tactic of turning towards one's breath, and in essence staying with and restoring your connection with yourself, particularly to repair what can be the post-traumatic mindset. Well, I hope today was useful really from a tactical standpoint of understanding some of the pitfalls of recovering from narcissistic abuse in this post-traumatic way, where some focus on what happened back then is useful and needed, but there's such a thing as too much of a good thing in that respect, and that it's equally important to kind of break the repetition of that retrospective looking and focus on one's experience right now, so that there's sort of that impermanence gets reintroduced to one's experience, subjective experience of life and yourselves. Well, thank you for watching today's video, and again, thank you for all of your support and comments and engagement with these videos in this channel. I look forward to posting another video next Sunday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Take good care.